Before I get into the different introductions of our speaker and our different the different organizations represented in here, I just want to also extend a welcome to those who are joining us from the Free State, who haven't previously been joining us, and also any SAFCEI faith leaders who are joining us who are not within the RACR project. And just a request to please mute yourself if you are not presenting. So if you're not speaking or not asking a question, please keep yourself on mute. We will also be checking and keeping you on mute throughout the presentation. Okay, so Claire, just to clarify, is my screen showing just the presenter, or can you also see my notes?
It's just your main screen, that there are no notes.
Great, okay. Okay, so for those of you who are new to our RACR project series, the RACR project is the Rural Action Climate Resilience Project. It's a EU-funded partnership project between SAFCEI, SCAT, the Social Change Assistance Trust, and Ryneveld Stiftung. And essentially, the intention of the project is to build an understanding of the impact of climate change in rural South Africa, and through building that understanding, build resilience to the impact of climate change in rural South Africa. And so far, most of that work has been happening in rural Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and Northern Cape. But of course, a topic like the climate change bill is relevant to much broader than just those three provinces. And yeah, so without further ado, let me introduce Brandon to all of you. So Brandon Abdinor is a climate advocacy lawyer and the acting program head for the pollution and climate at the Center for Environmental Rights. And within these roles, he engages with climate change policy, just transition advocacy, and strategic litigation. And he has been extensively involved in advocacy relating to the current iteration of the climate change bill, and works extensively with a variety of networks and stakeholder groupings to facilitate broad understanding of the bill and its implications. And Brandon is within, as I mentioned, the Center for Environmental Rights. So just to give you a bit of background on the Center for Environmental Rights, some of you met the attorneys who presented at the Learning Festival, but just to jog your memory, the Center for Environmental Rights is comprised of activist lawyers who defend the rights of communities and civil society organizations to an environment not harmful to health or well-being for present and future generations. And through litigation, advocacy, and activist support and training, they seek to advance a vision of a more equal society, free of fossil fuels, in which environmental and climate justice is realized and all people on the planet flourish. So yeah, they've got a great track record that they went into a little bit more at the Learning Festival, and I'm not going to talk too much more about them, but yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brandon. And yeah, thank you so much for making time to share a little bit about the bill and the progress of the bill at the moment.
Great, thank you, Tara, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. As someone who's been engaged in climate change issues since about 2004, it's just really gratifying to see how the interest and understanding in this topic has grown over those 20 or so years. And that the linkages between climate change and broader social and economic justice are just getting more and more understood. The Center for Environmental Rights, we definitely started from an environmental rights angle, which we're still very true to, but just understanding that these are intersectional issues, that we need to look at these environmental challenges and environmental rights in conjunction with the vision for a more beautiful society for everybody, where there is appropriate development, where people's rights to have a dignified life are protected and respected. So hopefully that will come through. I'm just going to share my screen. And we've left a lot of time for questions and answers. So please note them down as we go through. And then we can hopefully have some nice discussions afterwards. Just a little reference. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is contained in various useful tools and advocacy material, including fact sheets in a few different languages, as well as a video. And it's at that URL on the screen, climatelaw.org.za. So if anything that we talk about here is of interest for you to take further, by all means, go and take a look at this page. And a lot of these resources are there and available. One of the challenges around climate change generally is that the understanding of the issue is still very low in South Africa and around much of the world. And one of the things that we can do as activists is talk about the issue and help create an understanding in among the people around us as well. So I think it's one of those issues that if people really understand it, they're going to become activists simply because that's the nature of this challenge. And the other thing to bear in mind is that many of the obstacles for a good climate response come out of the ignorance and out of misinformation. There are people that exploit this lack of understanding. So the more people across the country understand these issues, the better for the whole climate struggle, if you like. So I'm going to be talking about the bill. The process of the bill is quite late in the day already. So most of the engagement has already happened, but I'll unpack that a little bit. So in talking about this today, it's talking about the bill and the opportunity that is still there to try and influence that, but also talking about when this bill becomes an act. How do we engage? In a sense, this has been a big process to try and get this bill as strong as it can be. But in a way, the real work starts once it becomes our Climate Change Act. And there are a lot of opportunities for engagement on the various pieces in the bill or the act. So I hope to highlight some of those today. The need for this is more urgent than ever, and the urgency and the importance of it is unfortunately not going away until we start seeing a change in direction. So the science comes in all the time and in a sense is more compelling that we need to take action, that the impacts are potentially even more severe than we thought. And we're obviously seeing these impacts. From a South African perspective, we know that the floods in eThekwini last year were intensified by climate change. The so-called Day Zero drought in Cape Town a few years ago was intensified by climate change. We saw a lot of damage to our coastlines, I think as little as 6 weeks ago. So we're not saying those are exclusively caused by climate change, but they're at least intensified. The politics gets ever more intense, and I'm going to probably keep coming back to the obvious one for South Africa, and that's our energy politics. Our electricity system is largely built on coal-fired power. So that's the one sector that needs to change the most. But we also know that there are vested interests that want to keep that system in place. And that translates into our political landscape, where we have different ministers supporting coal, or supporting coal one day and supporting climate response the next day. And obviously, this becomes quite a contested and challenging space. So we unfortunately can't divorce ourselves from that political landscape and need to engage with that as well. Governance challenges. Climate change is the kind of issue that really it exploits all the existing weaknesses. So whatever weaknesses there are in South Africa around governance gets made worse by climate change. And to have a sound climate change response, we need sound governance. And hopefully this climate change bill will put the right governance structures in place. We know that we have vested interests that want to make money regardless of the costs of making that money, and that the scope for corruption is there, and that happens as well. And South Africa is a particularly vulnerable space on the planet in terms of climate change. So the need to have a sound response is obviously critically important. Just to highlight, and this is the kind of thing that the bill needs to talk to. So this is one report, and the others like this. But this one from the Global Change Institute at WITS names what they believe are the most urgent climate risks facing South Africa. And that being food insecurity, shortages of clean water, a badly handled transition to low carbon energy. So in other words, if they decide not to close down those coal-fired power stations that need to be closed down, that would be where this risk comes in. And then we know by now that climate change is caused by what we call global warming. So literally the actual warming, the heat stress, the heat waves that happen are one of the top risks. And then those things in turn obviously impact on ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity. You know, at the end of the day, everything's an interrelated web. We actually are alive because bees pollinate plants, and bees come under pressure in a climate change situation. So that's an example of the kind of disruption that can have knock-on impacts and affect everybody. So just to give you a bit of an idea of where we're at with the climate change bill. So this slide shows the process in its completeness. It's drafted by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. This has actually been a long process that in a sense started in 2011. But at this point in time, the end is nearly in sight. So Cabinet approves that draft that comes from the department. And then the Portfolio Committee, which is made up of parliamentarians, oversees the process of ensuring proper public participation. And at this national level, there's been extensive public participation. Parties were invited to send in written comments. And then pretty much anyone that wanted to could address this Portfolio Committee. So there've been dedicated hearings to the Portfolio Committee via Zoom, as well as, I can't remember the number now, but there were between 2 and 3 public participation hearings in each of the provinces. So well over 20 hearings. I went to the one in Khayelitsha, for example, and it's a hall full of people. Certain of the Portfolio Committee members sit up there, and people get to share their experiences, their thoughts about the bill and their concerns, and that hopefully sways those politicians that are meant to be there to look after our interests to also ensure that there's a strong bill. And then it goes from there to the provinces, or the National Council of Provinces to be more precise, and that is where this bill is at the moment. So it's been gone through the national process, it's been kind of passed by Parliament, and it now goes to the National Council of Provinces, where what they call a select committee sits. And it will consider again the climate change bill and all the implications, tending to want to do that through looking at it from a provincial point of view. But this is the almost last opportunity to make input into the bill at that level. We don't know when that is going to be. We know that Minister Creasy is very strong on progressing this bill and wants it to become an act before Parliament finishes its session, I think in around April next year. So we're expecting this to go to the National Council of Provinces and be heard there in the committee meeting, probably early next year. As soon as we have any insight into when that is, we'll happily share that. But right now, we don't know exactly when that's going to be. Once the National Council of Provinces is happy with that bill, it goes back to Parliament, and Parliament approves it, and then it goes off to the President for signature. Should there be disagreements, should the National Council of Provinces not agree with what the Portfolio Committee has approved, there's a bunch of processes that can come into play, including mediation, and there's sort of structures within the Constitution and the parliamentary rules to try and iron out those differences. So we'll have to see what happens. I think the prospects of there being big changes still through the provincial process are not that high. But that's not to say it's a rubber stamp, and there may still be an opportunity, and there may still be changes that come out of there. So this is just some sort of background thinking on how to approach an engagement at the National Council of Provinces, but it applied to the national as well, and it applies to all of the lawmaking processes, so not just around the climate change bill. So this is quite useful information to have when engaging with policy. And I will be highlighting in the presentation areas within the climate change bill that allow for public participation. And I think the big call from my side today is to know what those processes are and get engaged. And these are some of the principles and approaches that you can consider when you're engaging with those. So really, when one makes input at the hearings, it's an opportunity to share views, opinions, concerns, and objections. And that you can present in a tone and a language of your choice. Often with these, something like the climate change bill, there will be a lot of very sort of expert parties that get involved from the science point of view, from an economic point of view, and they might come there with very fancy reports and figures and numbers and all sorts of considerations. And those are obviously important to get that expertise there, but they're actually more important than anybody's input. So you can be somebody who knows very little about climate change, and yet you know that climate change impacts you in certain ways, and you can go to those committees and actually tell your story about your situation, your experiences, and put those concerns on the table. Just to remind again, those committee members are elected representatives, so they really should be taking everybody's concerns into account. So the takeaway there is not to be intimidated, not to feel that you have to match those sort of more technical language that's coming from some people, but tell your story just in the way that you know it and you understand it. And these are the opportunities to then propose changes to something like the bill. It always helps a lot to describe your circumstances. So how climate change might affect you. And I've seen that in many of the public hearings. You'll have someone that comes from wherever it may be, and they'll talk about their experiences about how life was when it flooded where they were 2 months ago, for example. So there are no limits. I mean, you do want to keep, if you're at a climate change bill hearing, you do want to keep your input to climate change. A lot of people come in, and this comes back to the lack of understanding, and they'll talk about the litter in the area, for example, the poor waste management, which is an environmental issue. And it's not that it's got nothing to do with climate change at all, but what happens is if you start talking about something that's not necessarily focused on climate change and the bill, you might have the situation where the committee members kind of tune out and don't pay that much attention. So it's always worth bringing it back to the main purpose of that hearing or that meeting. It's definitely worth keeping a respectful tone from the point of view of, if you, to take an extreme example, go there and start swearing at the politicians, I mean, you'll probably be asked to leave the room. But that's not to say that you can't express your concern in very strong terms. These issues can and are emotional. I mean, people lose lives, they lose their livelihoods. So to go there and sort of express in strong terms even how you feel is appropriate. But, you know, one doesn't want to cross that line and start insulting simply because you do your own cause damage. But by all means, go there and let them know how you feel, and how you feel might be uncomfortable for them, but they need to know that. All input has value. So even if you go there and you call for certain changes to be made and they're not made, that doesn't mean it hasn't had value, because all comments need to get recorded. And the committee actually needs to sit and consider all of those comments. So for the climate change bill, for example, the department had to come up with a 655-page response document. which actually had a table and it had all the comments that were made, and the department had to then justify why it's agreeing with what you're saying, or it's not agreeing, or it agrees but it can't incorporate it, or it will incorporate. So putting all those views there has value, because it makes those decision makers think about the issues. And, you know, we always think of governance and government as this very top-down thing where these kind of very fancy people decide how it's going to be, and they sort of impose that on everybody. And really, I think for activism of all types, to keep pushing it so that there's also the bottom up, so that the story from the people who are living the experiences also go up to the decision makers, and ultimately we hopefully all making the laws together. We've got a long way to go in that regard, but I think it has improved, and our constitution does provide for participation. From a procedural point of view, hearings should be conducted in a spirit of listening. So we also come from a history where public participation was seen as a tick box exercise, that people just sort of came into a hall, spoke for an hour, maybe with a PowerPoint, and sort of downloaded a whole lot of information at everyone, and didn't really sort of take the spirit of listening into account. That's starting to change. And when we are in those hearings, we can demand that that happens. We can demand that the proceedings are translated into a language of our choice, or certainly an official language of our choice. And if we notice, and this has happened, that the interpreters are not interpreting what you're saying correctly, you can object in the moment, and bring it to the committee's attention that your point has not been translated correctly, and that you have a right for it to be done so. They should also present the information in accessible and understandable language and terminology. So if they arrive there and just sort of give you graphs and numbers and sort of these scientific terminology, you can say, can you please break that down for me? And again, that in a sense trains them so that the next time they do that, they will do it more properly. And we, as Tara mentioned in the intro, we are also engaged in strategic litigation. So we raise these issues in our court papers all the time. Public participation and the adequacy of public participation is almost a standard objection that we raise, except in those few instances where it's been run perfectly. So that's very seldom. And it does make the decision makers up their game over the years. So they start to improve because they don't want to run into court cases or objections. And then, as I say, everything that you say there will be recorded and it will be made publicly available. So when the call comes to speak to the National Council of Provinces, these are some of the principles that you can bring into being. And I'm now going to go into what, and this is not to suggest what you should go and tell the committee, but it's to give you an idea of something that you can consider. At the end of the day, some of this stuff might talk to you and resonate with you, and you might want to take it forward. And there might be things in here that don't. And then, you know, it's entirely at the end of the day, your choice, what you want to bring to their attention. From our perspective, we think that the very fundamental message, which might sound obvious, is just to emphasize how important this act is and how urgent it is. And the reason is that there are many who don't want this act in place because it's going to restrict them. And again, very sort of simple and obvious example is like a very carbon intensive or high greenhouse gas emitting company doesn't particularly want these controls and limits in place. An example might be a company like SAFCEI. So just to even tell the decision makers that you think it's important that this legislation is in place and that it's urgent because the climate crisis is urgent alone sends a signal of support and helps nudge them into the right direction. So as simple as this is, I do feel that this is something that can be, one can't say it too much, put it that way. Then another sort of issue that we have with the bill is around access to information and transparency. So what the bill says at this point in time is that any information that is provided to the minister in terms of this bill should be made publicly available, subject to PIA and PAPIA. So I think I understand that many of you are sort of paralegals of some form or another and may know these, but just to explain, PIA is the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and PAPIA is the Protection of Personal Information Act. So both of those pieces of legislation are quite important, and they help to create a culture of transparency of information, but they also have certain defenses. So if you are being asked for information, say you're SAFCEI, and someone wants to know what your climate response plan looks like, one of the defenses in PIA and PAPIA can be that you don't have to disclose information that is commercially sensitive. So we don't particularly like this. We understand why the needs for protection around information are there, but we feel that PIA and PAPIA can be abused. And this is what our experience is, to avoid giving information that should actually be provided. So we've called in our comments for this to be strengthened. It unfortunately hasn't. But again, in the ongoing work with the bill and with the act, once it comes into being, one can and should keep on pushing for that information. Just as an example, to put our submission together, we did research of different climate change bills and acts around the world. And the best case scenario, I think it's in Guatemala or somewhere in Latin America, that actually speaks of creating a website that's publicly accessible, that has all the climate-related information of the country available in one place. So even if this bill is not as strong as we want it to be, that's the kind of thing we keep pushing for. We want to know which municipalities have submitted their plans, which greenhouse gas emitters are not cutting their emissions. Just to name two examples of the kind of information that one would like to see. So it should be easily accessible and understandable. We've had a long history of working in the air pollution space, and to get information out of both the government and ESCOM, for example, has really been very challenging. One of the other concerns that we've had with the bill is the urgency. So we know from the science, from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for example, or IPCC as it's called, that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 45% in just, what's it now, 6.5 years, 5 years, 6 years time. So we're not sure that the bill necessarily captured that urgency. The impacts are intensifying, so there were no timeframes for carbon budgets, and I'll come into what those are, and our pathway to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What is good news is that this work is carrying on, even though the bill doesn't have timeframes. Along with colleagues, I sit on a few working groups that have been set up by the department to look into all of these mechanisms like carbon budgets. So these are going to be brought into being via regulations once the act is in place. And certainly the current minister, who we have many complaints about a lot of the time, I would say also, though, does understand the actual urgency and severity of the climate crisis, and therefore the team has been doing this. The worry is what happens after elections. What if a minister comes in that understands this less, or perhaps that has got fossil fuel interests, and then doesn't push all of these things? So that's why in our submissions and in the public hearings that we participated in, we said we want timeframes for these things, and they must reflect the urgency. We've also said that there should be scientifically sound targets. So, I mean, it's really been mapped out by the scientific community how much we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by in order to stay within safe limits. The feeling was that the bill was weak on those. It has, however, incorporated our Paris Agreement targets, or NDCs, which is an acronym for Nationally Determined Contributions. So that is in there, and provided those targets or NDCs are quite sound, then the act should ensure that it's law to follow those emissions reduction pathways. The bill fortunately does in a number of places talk about the need to ensure that climate action is based on the best and latest available science. So that is one good thing. We actually pushed for it to be even stronger and suggested that perhaps an independent scientific body should be established that advises on things like targets. So just so that takes the politics out of it. That is not in there, but it's still the kind of thing that we can continue to push for. And there are certain places in the world, I think even in the UK, where this independent scientific body does exist, and it comes out with the latest information on just, what sort of climate response we need to take. One of our big complaints as well about the bill was that the penalties and compliance were weak, that the bill didn't have the teeth it needed. So, for example, when we were doing work on the Carbon Tax Act last year, we had a situation where a company like SAFCEI was kicking against having a higher carbon tax, and said that perhaps they would choose to continue emitting greenhouse gas emissions and just pay the extra tax. Because the bill doesn't actually make excess greenhouse gas emissions an offense. And that is really unfortunate. Instead, it says that if you exceed your carbon budget, you will have to pay a higher tax rate. So in a way, it allows the polluters to pay to pollute. And our feeling was that if a company continues to refuse to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they should be subject to penalties. It should be an offense, and they should be able to be prohibited from doing that. That's not been in place, and we suspect that big business has been lobbying extensively over the past years to ensure that that doesn't come into being. The bill also provides for a cooperative governance, so really to try and establish an all-of-government approach across provinces, municipalities, national, and to really give the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment the power to manage that. And that's something that's not necessarily in there. And we might have a situation where you get the Environment Department kind of competing with the Department of Energy that wants to stick with coal or some other harmful activity. So that's part of the politics, and we're going to have to see how that plays out. The bill is a little bit weak on ensuring that happens, but the structures are there, and this is why we need to continue participating in all of these mechanisms once the Act comes into being. So just want to go into some of the specifics of what the Act can and should be talking about. On the mitigation side, so just a reminder, mitigation is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions so that we slow down and halt the harm that's happening to the climate. So the bill talks about a greenhouse gas emissions trajectory being set by the minister. But unfortunately, there's no time frame. However, this is now arguably our Paris Agreement target. So indirectly, it is there. Then the minister needs to come up with sectoral emissions targets. So that's saying that this is the size of the pie of how many greenhouse gases we can still emit and stay within safe limits. How do we allocate that across different sectors? So, I mean, ones that come to mind, obviously, are the energy sector, very much so. That's the biggest source of emissions. But then other sectors like agriculture, transport, built environment, all have their own climate impacts and their own impact on the climate. So this process of deciding which sectors get which targets is going to be quite a political process, I think. For example, we know that the energy sector is the easiest one to actually reduce emissions in, because, to put it very simply, we can switch from coal to renewables. So why should the energy sector get to have a big chunk of this carbon space when actually it could change? Whereas, for example, in the industrial sector, steel making is very difficult to reduce emissions. So perhaps, at the end of the day, we do need steel, There are people employed in that sector, so perhaps that sector should be given a bit more leeway, and a bit more time to also get to reduce its emissions. So how this dividing up of the pie is going to happen remains to be seen. If you look at the slide where I've put the PP in red, that's where there is a public participation process opportunity. So these are the ones that I'm urging all of us to keep an eye on and become involved in when they come up. Because then all of these principles that I've spoken about up to now can be brought in at these public participation processes. At the end of the day, we just need to keep on being pressure on government and on the sort of carbon intensive sector to do the right thing. Because if they left, they're just going to sort of backslide and try and stick to business as usual. I'm just going to skip that first one, but on carbon budget. So this is where the minister actually allocates a carbon budget to a particular party. It's not going to be something that's allocated to ordinary people. It's going to be the companies that are emitting high levels of greenhouse gases. So a SAFCEI will be told that your carbon budget is X, and you may not exceed that. And this is the thing that we wanted to make it a penalty if they do exceed it, and that hasn't happened. But at the very least, they'll get a higher carbon tax rate, which hopefully will encourage them to go in the right direction. The bill doesn't set a time frame for that, which is a worry. But again, the team is at the department is very engaged in this, and some colleagues and I have been invited to a workshop on the 11th of December to go and workshop how these carbon budgets need to be allocated. I'm going to skip that as well. I want to move on to adaptation quickly, because this is, in a sense, mitigation and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions happens at a very central level. And it's talking about really big policy decisions, like how do we make our electricity? And in a way, on the mitigation side, although we can and should engage to keep putting pressure, this is not really where most people will engage with the Act. It's more on the adaptation side. So that's adapting to those climate impacts that we know are coming no matter how well we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So the minister must come up with a national adaptation objectives and scenarios. It needs to be based on the best available science. So this is the kind of country's national adaptation plan and considerations, and there's a public participation process in that. And 2 years after the Act's in being, this adaptation strategy and plan must be published. And the whole idea is that it reduces vulnerability of the economy, society, and the environment, and really ropes in all of government as well as the private sector, as well as civil society. Then once that national adaptation plan is in place, then each of the sectors, so again, for example, agriculture, transport, energy, whatever it might be, must come up with a sector adaptation plan. That's 2 years after the national plan. And this is our complaint, that the bill doesn't reflect the urgency, is if you think of the national plans 2 years after the Act, then the sector plans are another 2 years. We're talking about 4 years before there's an adaptation strategy and plan. The good news is that many of the sectors are engaging with this and have some form of a draft plan in place already. For example, the agricultural sector. We question whether they've got the best draft plan in place, but it is there and the thinking is happening. So again, those are subject to public participation. And if your interest, for example, is in food and food sovereignty, this would be an adaptation plan that you want to get involved in. For example, on food sovereignty, I mean, we have a situation where it's like with every sector, the loud voices there at the moment are those commercial interests. So the big agricultural companies, the fertilizer, pesticide companies, those that make a lot of money out of food production, tend to set the agenda and decide what's in there. And this is why the public participation is so important, that our voices can also get in there and say, hold on, you know, there are better ways of doing this. We can, if you know the landscape a bit, we push for agroecology, more permaculture type, sort of more climate friendly, people friendly, planet friendly approaches to food production. And then the provinces and municipalities, and this is probably the most important part in a sense, must also come up with their own climate response plan. So they need to map the vulnerabilities and the risks and then come up with a response plan. So this goes for every municipality, whichever one it may be. And this is where we can and should engage a lot, because we want to avoid a situation where a municipality, whichever one it may be, you could call it Virginia for the sake of an example, decides what it thinks the right sort of climate adaptation measures are without consulting properly with the people, because the people who are impacted actually understand what their needs are as well. So that's why it's important to be involved in those public participation processes and let the needs from the ground also come up to the decision makers, so that the plan on how we adapt to climate change is actually something that comes from everybody. And it's not something that's done to communities, but something that communities participate in. So to sum up, engaging with the bill where it is now, and then engaging with the act going on once the act's in place, we definitely need this legislation. It's urgent. We want strong targets. We want proper compliance and enforcement. We want information to be made easily available. And we want to see all the different sectors of government get involved. And this is where it's up to us. I mean, there'll be municipalities that don't really have the expertise or the understanding. That's where we need to come in, all of us, and say, are you looking after our climate change needs? And all the related needs, food growing, how we can have economic opportunities and livelihood, all of it is interlinked. And the Climate Change Act can be that place that allows all of these thoughts and considerations and engagement to come in. I think I will leave it there. And yeah, as said earlier, very happy for questions and discussions and sharing your own experiences. Does this bill, do these issues talk to you in some way? What is happening in your environment that is making you think about what this bill is and what it could do?
Thanks so much, Brandon. That was a really, like, you went through all the, quite extensively. I found I was very engaged for the entire presentation, and I know that there are people in the audience who, are from different parts of South Africa that have experienced the flooding in the Eastern Cape recently, and yeah, so I think I have quite a few different questions that I would like to ask you, but I want to open the floor to everyone in this call. I don't know, Nombudiso, if you wanna talk about Port St. John's or Tembakazi. Yeah, but any thoughts or inputs about what you've heard so far? I know that people have also been struggling with connectivity, but yeah, the floor is open. I'm gonna give a few minutes for people to collect their thoughts, because also you need to digest before formulating questions. Or maybe I'll start with one of my questions to make use of the time, and then we can always get back to the broader group. And also, I'm going to turn on my camera. So you mentioned this possibility, if the act gets passed, that there will be certain expectations on municipalities to sort of develop these plans, and a lot of the people in this group have different engagement that they've been trying to do with municipalities. Some people have even been talking about running workshops with municipalities on on educating them about climate change and their own local climate change impacts. But yeah, maybe you can share a little bit more detail on what that would actually look like if municipalities are expected to, what are the legal requirements for municipalities to act?
Absolutely. And just to maybe start off saying, I think the initiative to educate the municipalities is excellent. There'll be those within municipalities who understand and those who don't yet. And obviously also just to kind of differentiate, I think, between the elected councillors, who in a sense have to represent your interests, and in a sense you can put a lot of pressure on them. But often those political appointments, or not appointments, but those political positions, they're the ones that might have all sorts of interests that they're trying to balance. And they might be wanting to look after someone within the municipality who's a polluter. So that's where the unsound action can sometimes come in. And that's where one needs to watch those politicians and take them to task if they are making decisions that are unsound. So in terms of what the bill requires, so firstly, it is that the municipalities undertake a risk and vulnerability assessment. So that's where they should sit and say, right, we are located here, say it's Mthatha. This is the kind of weather that we have in Mthatha. This is the condition of our infrastructure. This is what's expected to come from a climate change perspective. So just for example, most of the eastern side of the country, from sort of the Mozambique border down to the Southern Cape, is expecting more severe rain. Not necessarily more total rain, but when it rains, it's going to rain harder and it's going to rain more intensely over a shorter period of time. So that municipality should say, this is where we're at. This is what's expected in terms of climate change. What do we need to do as a municipality to counter that more extreme flooding? The western part of the country is expected to become drier. So that municipality needs to start thinking, what happens when the droughts get more severe and the droughts get longer? What is it that we can put in place? So what we can do once the act comes into being is start engaging with the municipality and say, so what have you got on your map of risks? Are you taking this and this into account? And just try and get as engaged with that as possible. And once they map the risks, then they need to come up with a response plan. So the risk is drought. The response plan might be try and source different types of maize seeds that are actually more drought resistant. I mean, these are very real practical examples of things that are happening out there. And then just earlier, when I wanted to distinguish between the politicians who are elected and those who are officials, so whose job it is to work in the municipality and take care of these things, those people often have a kind of a more like trustworthy and authentic response, because they are the ones whose job it is to make sure something happens, to make sure that if it rains hard, this doesn't get washed away. And they are the ones through sometimes very difficult lessons are starting to understand the very practical ways in which climate change is biting. So maybe those two groups within the municipality need a different approach. But to sum up, engage with them about what does their risk map look like? Have they thought about the things that you know about, or that your clients know about, or that your community knows about? And if they haven't thought about that, is to make sure it gets included in that risk map. And the next step is to say, okay, so what are your response plans? How are we going to manage all those risks?
Yeah, thanks for that. I can see that Noboniso is jumping in and out because I think with
Tara.
Connection. Hi.
Yes, Tara. Yes, Tara.
Do you want to say anything about about Port St. John's and your engagement with the municipality, because I know that that's been quite a long story. And maybe you could get some, yeah.
Yes, unfortunately for this meeting, I was in and out because of network, so I've lost a lot, but I'll catch up from the recordings. Actually, in Port St. John's, there's no plan in place. Also, even the policy, they are waiting for the district and the province to assist the municipality to develop the policy in terms of climate change. But we since last year, if I'm not mistaken, or at the beginning of this year, we are experiencing a huge floods in Port St. George, which was affecting most of the vulnerable people. The main cause of that is the what is this?
Nobody, so you muted yourself.
To be up,
Yeah.
need to be up. Our drainage system need to be upgraded because some of the people, in fact, it's not a legal occupation occupants. They just built on top of the pipes, and we have that estuary that is going to the sea and small springs that is going also to the sea, which cause flooding in Port St. George, because when we're experiencing a heavy rain, those two rivers is giving us a problem in Port St. George. But if the municipality can upgrade the system, the drainage system of the town, can assist us. Also, there is a need of removal of the people who build their houses in the wrong place. But we have a challenge in our municipality of land, because even the land which the town is situated, it's under claim. So if the municipality need to remove those people, we have to buy land from someone. And if we buy land, those people will be far from their work. So we are in that scenario in Port St. John's. Otherwise, the floods is still, we are going to experience it again and again up until we are addressing the way our town is situated. Okay. Thank you, Tara.
Thanks, Nombani. So yeah, I think that's great input, and it's like such a great example of exactly how climate change impacts on service delivery, and also how the Climate Change Act could be used to help. So this issue of poor drainage is something that's very widespread, and I mean a lot of the floods in eThekwini were made a lot worse because of the drainage. So once the Climate Change Act is in place, one can then go and say, look, there's this additional piece of legislation. I mean, they should already be taking care of this issue of drainage, but one can say there's this additional piece of legislation that needs to, that compels you, the municipality, to take the necessary steps. So again, when they are mapping their risks, is to highlight to them this issue of flooding and drainage. Is it on your map? What are your plans for making sure that when it rains hard the next time, the flooding is not going to happen? Yeah, the issue of people building where they shouldn't, I mean, that's also like a countrywide issue, and often it's a case of like people are desperate and they end up building wherever they can find somewhere to build. So yeah, I mean, there's different approaches depending on where that is. I mean, there are some places where there are informal settlements. It's just not wise for that informal settlement to stay there, because people are going to lose everything and they could lose their lives. So I mean, there's some that are very close to rivers where in no way does it make sense for them to stay there, because they're just going to be at huge risk. The challenge is what does one do with that? And as you say, often, you know, people get moved to somewhere that's far away, and that's like just not fair on them as well. So again, this is why this engagement with the municipalities, because then there'll be other informal settlements that are possible to upgrade, to put infrastructure in. And for example, in the Western Cape, that is one of the approaches for some of the informal settlements, is saying, okay, well, this is where people are now. So it's like not a one size fits all, but just make sure that those issues are on the risk map, and that the municipality is prioritizing these things sufficiently. Because, and this is where the municipalities might need reminding. As you said, Nomaniso, I think the municipalities do need support from the districts and the provinces. You can't expect every municipality to know what climate impacts are expected over the next 5 years. And this is why we need to ensure that our national and provincial politicians are also on board, to be providing that assistance, both technical assistance and financial assistance to the municipalities, to help them protect life and infrastructure.
Are there any other comments or questions from the broader group? Because I know that, you know, many of you who were part of the regional workshops this year, you'll remember that we did this mapping exercise where we were looking at vulnerability in the landscape. So, and you were looking at your different specific landscapes as well. So maybe you just have some thoughts that you want to share as well from that exercise, and maybe insights. Yeah, and I was also thinking, Brandon, wondering what would the legal implications of a municipality not adequately engaging communities on risk and vulnerability mapping? Are there any sort of legal implications if that engagement is not properly done, or not currently?
Yeah, that's always the tricky challenge, is how do we hold those in power to account? And the bill doesn't provide anything extraordinary in this regard, like none of the legislation really does. But what you can do then is engage in advocacy with the municipality and say, look, in terms of section 17.2 of the thing, you are supposed to be doing this risk and vulnerability. And that puts them on notice that you've seen they're actually behaving illegally and you're watching them. How to make them do that is another story. I mean, that's what the Office of a Public Protector should do. And I mean, that's where the courts, unfortunately, sometimes have to be used, where you actually send a letter of demand. And this is where it's really tricky, because litigation is so expensive and time consuming. But one can end up taking them to court. But one can also say that it's in their performance, like they're compelled to perform in this way to obey legislation. And if they're not, they can be threatened with sort of their jobs, if you like, or not being re-elected. You know, this is the thing, is that all these, like using the courts, using the law, needs to be used in conjunction with other sort of campaigning and advocacy. So one of those things is make the issue like widely known, that particular mayor is continuing to refuse to do a climate risk exercise. Let more and more people know, and then that starts to bring political pressure onto them as well. If they want to be re-elected, they actually need to pull their socks up and engage with this. And that's where sort of the participatory democracy side comes in. The more we engage, the more our voices are heard, the more we understand our rights and demand them, the more hopefully pressure comes to bear on these decision makers. And look, in our experience, there are a lot of success stories and there are a lot of frustrating stories where that doesn't work, or it takes years and years. And there are others where you bring that pressure to bear and things start to change. So it is an ongoing struggle. But the more we know what the rights are and what their obligations are, the more we can, you know, it's one thing going to a meeting with a councillor and talking in general terms, but if you show them the act and the section, then it becomes a bit of a different story, because then they understand that you know what it is that they're supposed to be doing, and that puts pressure on them.
Hello, Tara.
Yeah, come in, Nominisi.
Yes, I also agree with the Brandon, né? Because although there are these public participation in our municipalities, but it's not effective enough. Why I'm saying that? It's because when they come for public participation, they just point people who is going to speak what they want to speak. You see, that's the challenge that we are facing. Although they have on their plan, they implement them, but there's no space for the people who understand the laws, that can contribute or engage on those meetings. So it's a closed session, but it's called public, but in a public meeting. So it's like that, Brandon. I agree. I fully agree with you. Thank you.
No, I hear you. Those that want to hold on to power, they'll use all sorts of means to do that. Sometimes it's useful to understand who someone's boss is. So, you know, even a mayor or a town manager or whoever has got someone that they report to. Maybe it's someone in the province, or and then, you know, you start to threaten and eventually write to the higher ups, which can also bring some sort of pressure. But yeah, I hear you, Nominee. So it's like a challenge all around, and it can sometimes be a very tiring fight. But again, we chip away at it all the time, and you never know which little piece of action you take suddenly creates a change. But again, the more people that understand the issue, I mean, if the entire town knew that this climate response needs to happen, and makes a noise, then eventually those in power will realize they're going to be voted out, and be replaced by someone who does take this seriously. I think it's still early days, but I think climate change is going to change the political landscape around the world, because more and more people understand it, more and more people feel the impacts, and when they do, then they start to demand change. So hopefully in 5 years' time, things can be dramatically different.
I think I might start calling on people for their inputs. So I don't know, Sanele, maybe you have something to say, or Vuyani. I know, Vuyani, you've also made some attempts to talk to local municipalities. Kumbulani, or Sindiswa. Nosipo. I'm going to go through the entire list of people. Okay, so Claire is asking you to reflect on where will you be taking the information you have received in this seminar. So what are you gonna be doing with this information?
Hello?
Hi, Vuyani, go for it.
Okay.
I think, was it Vuyani? No. Oh, it is Nomboniso.
Yeah, it is me, Vuyani.
Yeah, go. What will you be doing with the information that you received in this seminar?
I think we are going to try to make sure that our municipality try to make sure that everything that we will try to make sure that is working, because we have a problem that even if we send letters to municipality, it doesn't care about our letters, because we send letters to the municipality, but there's no response that we found to them. Did you hear me?
Yeah, I did. I think this was, so we tried to send letters earlier on in the year, a number of different organizations linking service delivery targets to climate change concerns, and most of them, in fact, I think all of them didn't receive any input, and that's what I think Vuyani is referring to.
Yeah, I hear that. It's a huge frustration. I think that doesn't mean one shouldn't send those letters, because eventually one might end up going to court, or I don't know what might happen. And it's always good to have the track record to say, well, we actually did alert the municipality to this in April and again reminded them in June. So it's not that it's a complete waste of time, but sometimes one needs to get onto the streets or whatever it is that like really wakes people up enough. And the more people that start saying the same thing, the more chance that it will be heard and responded to. But I hear the thing. I mean, we send lots of letters that never get replied to.
Sanele has written in the chat. She says, I'm going to share information to our community and ask the municipality to do their work accordingly, even though we don't have a municipality in Mount Fletcher. We have to travel 60 kilometers to meet the municipality. Yeah, I think also another thing, and Claire's saying also to send letters several times to encourage the municipality to respond. Another thing that it would be interesting to hear from all of you, like, what if you were to engage on the climate change bill, what would be the climate change impact that you would focus on? So like, what would be, like we've heard now, Nomboniso, you spoke about flooding and drainage clearance, but just maybe we could have a moment to like reflect on what would the climate change impact be that impacts you specifically, and you can also just maybe share with the broader group, because from what Brandon has said is that there may be this opportunity for public participation on the climate change bill, and it would be useful to be able to bring your voices to those spaces and highlight the climate change impacts that you are experiencing in rural South Africa. So we know flooding from Nomboniso, and of course then it's not just one, they're multiple impacts, but I don't know if anyone else wants to share.
I think to me, Clem, it will affect the fruit produce. The issue of if we are not attending to it, it will affect the food produce in terms of high prices, also the poor harvest for the farmers will be affected with so many diseases. So it will impact it to the lives of the poor. But those who are affording will be safe, but those who are in a bad situation now, it will be more giving them a negative results. So if those who are in power is not assisting us now, because now we can, like our communities, there are initiatives that we can do while we are waiting for government, but we need some assistance from from those who are in power. So in terms of food, really, it will be a crisis in South Africa. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, go Tara.
No, and I also linking to sort of small, economies, local economies that are tied to those, so like employment that are linked to the food production, the fruit sellers, the people who work in fruit picking, all of these things as well. So definitely those most vulnerable. But also just to say there are quite a few points in the chat that I'll get to, but Brandon first, why don't you respond and then.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, Nomboniso, exactly. Again, I mean, food is a big one, and I think this can be really powerful for action. Is to tell the stories. So one can say, okay, food production is going to be impacted, but then if a group of people get together and they maybe growing a particular kind of food in an area, and they start to tell the stories, whether it's on social media or however it is, so that the lens goes on to that particular group about that particular issue and gets that information out there. One of the things we need for a climate response is a lot of money. I mean, that's unfortunately the case, but there is also a lot of money available. Some of that might be within South Africa, some might be from wealthier countries who've got climate funds available that want to do projects that support people to adapt and that kind of thing. And one can get a situation where if these stories come to the attention of the right people, that things can happen. Not enough climate finance is coming to the African continent as a whole yet. And that's simply because other parts of the world have told their stories, and that's where the funding is going for now. But to document the stories, tell them, take photographs, let people just video each other off your phone telling your story. This sort of information can get out there. And then also just another thought that came to mind is, yes, one can and needs to write to the municipality, but you can also get together as a group and write to national government or to the provincial premier or whoever it is. If you've got the time to keep highlighting these concerns at different levels, sometimes it lands in the right place. And you might get a premier that phones a mayor that says, pull your socks up, you need to sort this drainage out. That kind of thing can happen as well.
I don't know if people want to actually say their points that they've written in the chat verbally. I'm not sure who's joining us today from Tinicha. Claire, do you want to come in?
I wanted to add a point to what Brandon said, and just to say that the other role that we have as civil society is to build our networks. And I think that's a key strategy that we need to take more advantage of, because if you are in your community suffering with an issue that you want to bring awareness to, a great way to build support is to network with other groups and to find out what are their issues, how can you support them, and to build a platform around a specific issue or group issues together. And in that way you build support. So if you do end up going to a meeting, it's not just your organization. You could go with a whole group of 5 organizations or more, link it to church groups, link it to parent groups or youth groups. And in this way, it's going to spread the message and just show the representatives that you're meeting with that this is really an issue of concern, because as Brandon said, these issues are going to be getting worse. If you've experienced flooding before, you're going to experience more flooding. And I mean, that's not even the worst of it, frankly speaking. So I think we need to take opportunities like this. And that's why the question in the chat was, what are you going to be doing with this information? Because like Brandon's presentation was so fantastic. It laid it out in such a clear and understandable format. And we will share the recording of the seminar, but I urge you to take this forward, share it with your networks, and plan meetings, arrange a time to discuss it. Thank you.
And I like Nonsikelelo's comment in the chat of using the word accountability, that just keep reminding the municipalities and all public officials of their accountability, because they are accountable.
Yeah. Nomboniso, I saw you unmuted yourself. Do you want to come in? Yeah, no, maybe not. And I think there are a lot of I mean, there's also, we've spoken a lot about flooding, because that was the example from Nomboniso, but then also, drought is also another concern, and many people within this call have community food gardens where they're trying to do kind of permaculture approaches. But, you know, there's also something that can be said about building a climate response through sharing that knowledge as well, like within networks, and making the link between that and as a response to climate change as well. Nomboniso, do you want to come in? I can see that you've unmuted, but I'm not sure if you have something to add.
No.
No, okay. Yes, and Claire saying recording no response to letters is also important. If you don't get a response, that's also a response. I know that we have.
Yes, Tara?
Oh, I was just wondering if you had something else to add, because I saw that you had muted yourself, but I mean unmuted yourself. But I'm not sure if you do. Okay, I'm going to assume that maybe you didn't. Just before we end, I just wanted to ask one more question of you, Brandon, on just on like parallel bills that are currently in, you know, in particular the upstream petroleum resource development bill, and I just wanted you to maybe share a little bit on what your thoughts are, like if that gets passed, how do you see there being some kind of competing between these, and is there a kind of, do you think there would be coherence within kind of having both of those legally, I don't know what you would call ratified or whatever it is?
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, I mean, in theory, there should be space for both of those. And the Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Act is really there to kind of maximize the petroleum resources, or manage them in the correct way. So theoretically, we're talking about extracting oil and gas, really. Theoretically, that should be done responsibly, and then the Climate Change Act should be the watchdog of that. So yeah, do that, but do it but do it within what the Climate Change Act says. Unfortunately, we know that the backstory is they want to extract as much oil and gas as possible, and probably try and ignore the climate change bill as much as possible, and therefore we're going to have that struggle. So I would kind of say, let's not extract any more oil and gas at all. And that's what the scientific community around the world agrees. We don't have the carbon space to do that. But so that Upstream Petroleum Resources Act is not evil in itself, but we know that it's really there to facilitate not good activities at all. So theoretically, a good Climate Change Act that is well policed, because that's the other thing, is we need to see the political will across all of different sort of spheres of government to really get behind this climate change issue, and that's something that's not there yet. And that's just reminding me of maybe a final point I'd like to make around what can we do. We've got elections coming up next year, sort of national and provincial elections. So I think we're probably not going to see anything amazing in these elections in terms of climate change yet. But look at the election manifestos of the parties, and try and see which ones are actually taking this issue seriously, and perhaps those are the ones to consider voting for at some point in time, versus those who not really sort of paying much attention to the issue. And again, I predict that in 5 years' time, elections are going to start turning on this issue. Or if you are loyal to a particular party, and that's the party you do want to vote for, then through the party structures, start to say, well, you know, I'm a member of this party too, and I think we should be starting to take this issue more seriously. And Yeah, you can. So political participation, which happens when you vote, but also in other engagement, is important. And we're really just trying to push the awareness at every possible level. And that can even happen within a political party.
Yeah, and I also don't know if you want to just quickly also add something about the IRP, but maybe there's not enough time for that.
I can do it 30 seconds.
We have 4 minutes, I think, so
Okay.
so there should be enough time.
All right. So I mean, this should be of interest to everyone, really. In the countries that I don't know who knows, but the IRP is the Integrated Resource Plan, and that's the government's plan on where we get our electricity generation from. So that's the plan that says we're going to have this many megawatts of renewables, this much of coal, this much of gas. And there's an opportunity coming up when a new IRP gets published for public comment. And from a climate change perspective, we need to see an IRP that has huge allocations to renewable energy and little or none for gas and for coal. So that is a place where all of these things we've been speaking about for public participation, you can put into practice. We're working with SAFCEI and others to get fact sheets out there and awareness raising sessions. And then that's where you can make your voice heard that says, please, Minister Mantashe, more renewables, no gas, because gas and coal are just going to keep wrecking the climate. And the switch to renewables is the main thing we need from a mitigation perspective. So we expect that to come out maybe early December, and then there should be a public participation process for hopefully enough time to put comments in. And then they might even go around the country with having a sort of roadshow or public participation meetings. And it's a place where we can lend our voices for the right thing.
Yeah, so that's the IRP, which is separate from the climate change bill, but important to make that connection. And just lastly, before we wrap up, just to remind everyone, can you remind everyone the next stage in the bill will probably involve also provincial public participations. Am I right?
So I don't know how much participation there will be. So it's within the provincial structure, but it's not necessarily consultations in the provinces. So probably it might be a Zoom or something like that. It remains to be seen. But the next place to have input on the bill is the National Council of Provinces, and they should provide for public participation. So yeah, as soon as we have news, we'll happily share that.
Great. Well, I think this was really very useful, and thank you so much for a really informative session. And hopefully, those who are unable to connect due to network issues will be able to watch this recording.